In this module, we're moving right along into our job highlights by talking about UX researchers. All right, so in other videos, I know I have mentioned offhand that UX is part of the PDLC. So, what exactly is UX? There are many definitions. A definition from the International Organization of Standardization, the ISO definition right there, that says it's a user's perceptions and responses as a result of using a product or service. There's also one from NNG or Nielsen Norman Group that says it's all aspects of someone's interaction with a company and its products or services. It's a little bit broad for my tastes. And then the UX Professionals Association says that every aspect of someone's interaction with a product, service, or company and the elements that together make up the interface, including layout, visual design, text, brand, sound, and interaction, are all user experience. But when I'm explaining UX to someone in person, I usually just put it more simply. I say that it's the intersection of can someone accomplish what it was that they set out to accomplish when using a digital product, and then as they were attempting to accomplish that task, was it enjoyable or frustrating? There's a few ways that UX can be measured, and there's no official set of criteria that determines whether something has a good user experience or a bad user experience. But these six attributes, whether it's useful, desirable, accessible, credible, findable, and usable, apply to virtually any digital software you can imagine. And when these aspects are met, the software is typically deemed as valuable. The UX Honeycomb is a great framework that outlines the key qualities of a great user experience. A product should be useful, meaning it serves a real purpose and fulfills a genuine need, and desirable, with design, branding, and imagery that spark emotion and appreciation. It must also be accessible, ensuring that people with impairments or disabilities can use it. And it has to be credible so that users trust the information and promises that it delivers. It should also be findable, meaning that it's easy for people to locate what they need, and finally usable, allowing people to complete tasks with reasonable effort. When all these elements work together, they create true value for the user. You may have also heard of the term usability. Usability is a component of user experience, but they are not exactly the same thing. Usability refers to how easy and efficient it is for a user to achieve their goals. User experience, on the other hand, encompasses all aspects of the user's interaction with a product, including usability, but also emotional satisfaction, accessibility, overall effectiveness, visual appeal. So, in other words, UX is a broader concept that includes usability, but also considers other factors like enjoyment or frustration. So, now that we've established what UX is, we can talk about what UX researchers do. UX research is, more or less, the discipline of finding out by talking to users and evaluating the software whether or not that software meets the criteria of the UX honeycomb or any other criteria that a team seeks to meet. And if it doesn't meet those criteria, what can the team change so that it performs better? So, UX research is investigating the habits, tasks, wants, demographics, history, and more of the existing or hypothetical users of a product to better understand their needs and expectations when interacting with said product. So, then, this means that UX researchers study how people use products or why they don't use them to suggest user needs and improvements that the team can make. Let's talk a bit about some of the top responsibilities a UX researcher has to achieve that goal of making software products easier to use and more valuable. They talk to users, or they observe them in their natural environments, or they may take to the internet or other sources to do secondary research, which takes less time but is less reliable. A big part of the job is also conducting usability studies, meaning they watch users interact with software to see where it makes sense and where it doesn't. Once they've done whatever type of research they're going to do, they then have to compile a ton of data and extract the top 10% of what they found to translate to colleagues. So let's say you collect 100 quotes. You'll never have a meeting long enough to go over each one, and it wouldn't be worth it if you did. So you'll come up with high level trends and statistics and taglines that accurately depict those 100 quotes in a couple sentences. In addition to just translating findings from a particular study, UX researchers are often responsible for packing insights into a more general way to educate others at the company on things like who the users are, what their tasks tend to be, what their goals generally are, etc. They are also the ones responsible for figuring out when this research should take place, how long it should take, and other logistics. They will usually have some kind of milestone. In 6 months, the business wants to release ABC feature. So they will need to work in advance by some amount of time, and they will be in charge of making sure that the research is completed and that we learn everything we need to in time to still make that business milestone. They must present their knowledge, either formally or informally, to peers who then decide more or less whether or not to act on any of those recommendations from the UX researcher or to wait on making those changes, just depending on the trade offs of time and investment of making those changes versus how serious the recommendation is. One of the things that makes UX researchers really valuable is that they're great communicators. With participants, they have to build trust and rapport quickly so that they can get honest and useful feedback. But with coworkers, they need to build strong relationships so that they can have clear and direct communication because sometimes the UX researchers are the ones pointing out where designs or products need to improve. And with leadership, UX researchers have to be persuasive, showing them why investing in usability or product enhancements will pay off from the business sense. In other words, communication is at the core of everything that they do. When we talk about the top skills of a UX researcher, it really covers a wide range. First, there's obviously going to be research methods, which is a big toolkit to pull from, including interviews, surveys, usability tests, card sorts, ethnography, and we'll talk a bit about those in the next unit. Then comes analysis, taking all that data and distilling it into the key insights that colleagues can actually use. Communication is huge too, whether it's through presentations, project plans, UX artifacts, or simply having conversations. But at the heart of all of it is empathy. UX researchers genuinely need to understand the user's needs and behaviors. And of course, this is a collaborative role, so working well with both like minded and diverse teammates is essential. They also need strong interviewing skills, writing unbiased scripts, but being able to pivot in the moment to get the most valuable feedback. And finally, they lean on UX principles so that recommendations aren't just based on research, but they're grounded in best practices. So imagine that you've got 500 pieces of data from quotes to stats, error rates, little observations, and they're all scattered across Excel sheets, whiteboards, sticky notes, and even just rattling around in your own head. These 500 pieces of data just came from the study that you just completed as a UX researcher. Your challenge is, how do you actually make sense of all that and distill it down into the top 10 findings that matter most? This is where techniques like affinity diagramming, tagging and sorting data, or even using AI and machine learning like ChatGPT for UX research can really help. Honestly, one of the hardest parts of the UX researcher job isn't collecting the data, it's synthesizing hundreds of touch points into a story that makes sense for people who weren't in the room for every single session. That is the real craft of UX research. Another important skill of UX researchers is determining the severity of issues. Determining the severity of issues is really an offshoot of the previous skill mentioned, overall analysis. But part of what UX researchers need to communicate is, hey, this thing that I observed or this usability issue is really a problem, and here are the potential outcomes you can expect to see if you don't address this issue. Or maybe it's a cosmetic issue. Maybe people have a preference for the blue button over the green button, but it doesn't have a material difference in the overall usability of the site. So, this is something that you can convey to your peers, but it's not something that you would heavily prioritize. The last skill I want to highlight specifically, and one that is part of every single UX research job, is presenting those findings, your analysis. You might spend a week analyzing those 500 pieces of data, but they're pointless until they are shared. And sharing those findings is often done in a visual medium with visual aids like charts and graphs, statistics, and screenshots. So, having some basic design skills, specifically in the genre of presenting findings and statistics, is crucial. And not just design skills, but also knowing how to structure the presentation, how to set up context, and how to organize the concept. This is software where the UX researcher is showing screenshots of the application that was assessed with callouts that explain what performed well and what didn't. This is a very effective method of essentially bringing your audience along the journey with you and helping them imagine that they sat it with you in all those hours of sessions that you were in. And here's another example of using callouts to point out what works well and what doesn't, specifically on the user interface or UI. Another effective method is to distill really complex and nuanced data into really digestible formats and really simplifying all that detail into one bite of information. Another skill is making sure that you've made good use of the real estate of the canvas or slide that you're presenting with. And really, the art of data visualization is a whole field of study itself. But knowing how to structure data in a way that not only makes sense, but actually conveys the important details and doesn't overwhelm the audience is a key skill. So, finally, we're going to wind down this job highlight by recapping some of the top challenges faced by UX researchers. We've touched on a few of these, and I don't want to bang that drum any further, so I'll just say something specifically about these top few. running multiple studies at one time. This could mean that you're in the recruitment phase of one study, actually in the weeds of having sessions for another study, and then analyzing the results of a third study. The next two bullets on this slide are going to be talking a bit more in the next module. But the idea of proving value and or cost of your findings, it's not just about severity of the issues, but also translating the severity into the real world and what the impact will be if the issues are not fixed. Finally, knowing which UX method to use and when. We'll talk more about that in the next module, but UX researchers kind of need to straddle two fields of study. They need to know how the technical sausage is made from the development side. They also need to understand how to conduct research in a very methodical, scientific way. And I really like this quote about the importance of making sure that when you're conducting user research, you're talking to an appropriate sample of participants, especially the more niche your software is. Meaning that if you're designing an application for second graders to do their homework on, the research has to be conducted with a representative sample of that demographic, or else your research is pointless. But of course, some apps have a much more broad demographic base of something like Netflix, and the sample still needs to be representative, but at the same time, anyone can pick up Netflix and start using it. So the way that you might screen those participants may be less intense. Thank you for watching this week's module. Please access any other required supplemental reading or watching. Thanks.